This may feel like two very different subject matters, how to handle difficult conversations and managing stress, but I think the better we manage stress, the better able we are to handle all difficult situations. So it's not news to any of us, right, that when we're stressed, we're rarely at our best, and neither is anybody else. Unmanaged stress makes it more likely that we will be short-tempered, unable to think creatively, work collaboratively, be respectful. So we are going to talk about how to manage stress, and I hope that you'll feel free to weigh in about what stresses you or what you do to manage your own stress. But I want to start with managing those difficult conversations. So just being aware, first of all, right, that if you know you are stressed, and that can happen for so many reasons. It can be work related, it can be what happened at home in the morning and that is really tough to turn off when we hit the office door. It can be really challenging then to ensure that any conversation, particularly if it's highly emotive, remains constructive, and it's even less likely that it will remain constructive if more than one of you is stressed. So we all operate, our brains operate on glucose, and we have a limited supply every day. So first tip is, if you know that you're walking into a difficult conversation and you have any power or authority over when to schedule it, I highly recommend that it not be at 4 p.m. You know, most of us spend a lot of time with emails and conversations and meetings, and yet we go home and we're physically exhausted. And a large part of that is because our brains are exhausted. They have run out of glucose. And so mindfully managing when you handle difficult conversations matters. Similarly, Friday afternoon, not ideal. If it's not something that you can plan, but you get accustomed to doing what I refer to as my 2-second scan, which goes something like, who is this person to me? What is this conversation about? What does it mean to me? How much energy do I have? How am I doing? And I now don't think about those all purposefully. I just kind of do a, And then if I really feel like I don't have the energy, the attention to mindfully and respectfully engage in a conversation that somebody may just walk through the door with, I'm honest about that. And I say, you know, I can tell this is really important to you, or I can see that you are filled with angst, and I want to be able to do justice to our conversation. When tomorrow morning, or whatever chunk of time that you have, that is as soon as possible, when tomorrow morning will work best for you. And that does a couple of things. It allows me to be human, and I have learned over the decades that we all are, and so I no longer try to be perfect. And I find that it gives people with whom I interact then permission to also be human. And it's actually a place of strength to admit I'm worn out. I've had a tough day. And I validated the fact that they do need to speak with me, and I've given them some agency by allowing them to make the choice about when we do meet, since I've told them that this precise moment won't work. So that seems really simple and straightforward, and it basically is, but it does require that mindfulness about how am I doing? Do I have what it takes to engage in this conversation? And I fully recognize that we don't always have the choice to choose about that, but when we do, and I would argue that we do more often than we think we do, and that it may be that if somebody comes to us particularly in a highly emotive state, it's likely they are not in the best place either to problem solve, think creatively, work their way through a tough conversation.
Laura, can you repeat those things that you ask yourself in your 2-second scan? I want to capture those.
Yes, well, so every time I do that, I feel like I add one or change one, but the gist is, who is this person to me? What is the meaning of this conversation to me? What do I want? What do they want? What do I want out of the conversation? And how am I doing? Just physically, energy-wise? I think I may have missed one, and if anybody knows what that one is, feel free to weigh in. But that's the gist. There's this tremendous study done in 1998 by Rushworth M. Kidder, who founded the Institute for Global Ethics, and he died a few years ago. Our universe is the sadder for it. But in 1998, he did this global research, and he asked folks to answer two different surveys. One was about the values people appreciate about other individuals, and the second survey was about the values they appreciate organizations exhibiting. And his research data crosses every social identifier by which we categorize folks. So, it's just tremendously exhaustive, and the data points are very impressive. And what he found, likely not surprising, and since reading about this in his book, Moral Courage, I have utilized his survey all around the country when I train, and have gotten exactly the same results he did. So he argues that it's fairly universal that all people, regardless of ethnicity, gender, age, you name it, appreciate 5 behaviors: responsibility, respect, fairness, honesty, and compassion. And if you're taking notes, I'll read that one more time. It's responsibility, and I define that as personal responsibility, respect, fairness, honesty, and compassion. So I find it really useful to hang on to that, because when somebody appears in front of me and appears to be behaving disrespectfully, or I'm feeling unfairly treated, I try to remember that all of us value that, and so I use it as a hook. And I say, that feels disrespectful. And I'm very specific about what does feel disrespectful. And then I engage them in a conversation. This is what I need in order to feel respected. What do you need from me in order to feel respected? And it's just terribly powerful, because we all want to be respected, right? And it also is this fantastic interrupter of a conversation that might otherwise be in a downward spiral. It's like, oh, wait a minute. And if it's in a downward spiral, odds are that one or both of us, or all 400 of us, depending on the group size of the conversation taking place, have gotten hijacked by our brainstem, right? We get in a downward spiral when we feel threatened. Our brainstem kicks in, which turns off our frontal lobe, which means we cannot be creative, we cannot be compassionate, we cannot be problem solvers. And so hooking into one of those 5 behaviors is this really powerful, simple way of re-engaging the frontal lobe and interrupting that downward spiral. I'm going to go through just a couple more tips and then I'll pause, but if you want to raise your hand, or Lyle, are you able to sort of watch chat comments? And great. Something else that I observe and have learned personally is that the longer we're professionals, so the older we are essentially, and the more experiences we have, the easier it is to get hijacked by our memories and our experiences, and so to fail to be present for the person who's actually in front of us, right? We can have somebody with whom we've had a prior negative interaction, or we can meet somebody for the first time and they remind us of the person who gave us a headache for days on end last October, and they even talk in a similar fashion and you think, oh no. Or conversely, somebody can hijack you and remind you of somebody about whom you have very positive memories, and that seems like it's not necessarily problematic, but in fact it inclines us to overpromise, because we feel so good about that person, right? We want to do everything we can, and then folks get into trouble because they expand what they offer, suggest, say that they can do, because they're feeling so good on an emotional level about being in front of this person. So whether it's a negative hijacking or a positive hijacking, it's really tough to stay present if if we don't do something mindfully to be in front of the person with whom we are in front of. Most often what happens is that we've had one interaction that just felt uncomfortable for, you name it, you know, there are a whole host of reasons why that might happen. And because our brains operate on glucose, which is limited, our brains are pattern-seeking organs. So the very first time we meet with somebody, our brain starts to form a neuronal pathway and say, oh, I know Tom. Tom is this person. This is what happened last time, and so this is what needs to happen this time. And if it's negative, your brain is actually disadvantaging you and setting you up to interact with Tom defensively. When in fact, Tom may have been, and I apologize if there are any Toms on this call. It's just a name that I'm pulling out of the air. We get hijacked by that prior interaction, and our body language, our tone of voice, the way in which we ask a question, the type of question we ask, all may be really unjust to Tom because Tom may have just been having a rough day, you know, and that's not who Tom is. Or Tom has good days and bad days like we all do, you know. So it's just really important. When I started segueing in a prior life from being an attorney to mediating as part of my practice, I started wearing rings on my thumbs because as an attorney, I had a great deal of authority to say, this is what you should do. As a mediator, that's not appropriate. And I needed to remind myself that I'm there to facilitate a conversation and not to tell them what to do. So that worked for me because it was a physical and a visual sort of reminder that this is my role. Whatever you need to do to remind yourself to be present. You know, our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And even if you're not hijacked by negative or positive, we get hijacked by life, right? Oh crap, I forgot to get the hamburger out of the freezer this morning. I have no dinner plan. So I know that we've all heard over and over and over listening mindfully. It's really tough to do well. And it's even harder to do when somebody is coming at us with a great deal of emotion and accusing us of something, right? All emotions are contagious, so we can either get triggered by theirs and buy into that and become defensive, or we can be aware and mindful about our emotions. Reference that 2-second scan, which I'm constantly doing because I've learned how useful it is. And then either purposefully identify what emotions I'm experiencing and decide what I want to do with those, or get hijacked by them and feed into this downward spiral. So I've conflated a couple of different ideas. I want to go back to the emotions for a bit. All communications have two components, the factual content and the emotional content. And most of us in the dominant culture in this country have learned that it is unprofessional to bring emotion into the workplace. And I think that's just ridiculous because all of us experience emotions about everything that we do. And it is, in fact, what we do with those emotions rather than whether or not we have them that is the more appropriate question in the workplace, in my opinion. Our emotions tell us a great deal of information. It tells us what's important to us. It tells us how we're feeling about this person. It tells us perhaps what we're valuing and what we're having trouble listening to. All of that is very useful information if we're aware of it. We choose to listen to it and decide what to do with it as opposed to getting hijacked by it. And because all emotions are contagious, you know, I'm sure we've all participated in our lesser moments, somebody who comes in and says something in a loud voice and we interrupt them and we speak even more loudly, or we get defensive. And once we get defensive, then we're spinning a story in our head about how we're going to respond because they've got it all wrong, and if they only knew, and if I could correct them, and then we've interrupted them, and then they're defensive. And, So because all of us have emotional content that is imbued with every experience we have. It's terribly important when somebody comes to us, particularly when they're highly emotive, to validate first and foremost their emotions. I'm not suggesting that you are in agreement with those emotions or that you need to suggest you are in agreement. I am, however, saying that it's very useful to validate their emotional content and to say something like, I can see that this is terribly important to you, or I can see that you're very unhappy about this, or I can see that you're miserable. If we don't start there, we are social beings, and we're really eager for the people with whom we communicate to understand us, right? And if we don't see in their body language, or we don't hear from them verbally that they understand the import of the emotional content, we keep trying to convince them and to say it in a different way, and or we give up because we feel like they didn't hear us. Even if they could recite back verbatim the factual content, if we don't have some sense that they understand the emotional import of our message, we feel unheard. So for example, I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago, I responded to a request for proposals at this international conference that I'd been attending for several years. And some of my colleagues had tried and hadn't gotten their proposal accepted. And so I submitted it just kind of thinking, gosh, it'd be awesome to get accepted. And I don't really expect that to happen. But I got an email several months later telling me that my proposal had been accepted. And that was a really, really, really happy day for me. And I told 2 people that same day. And the first person I told, I made it fairly evident, you know, that this was happy news. It went something like, oh my gosh, you're never going to believe what happened. And I told them what happened. And the first person responded with something like, that's great. And I told the second person, and the second person, that person's face lit up with joy, actually picked me up, turned me around. This was my elder daughter. I don't let many folks pick me up. Twirled me around the kitchen and said, oh my gosh, Mama, that is so great. I had no doubt that she understood how significant an event that was for me. None, right? Her emotional response absolutely met mine, and I felt heard. The first person, I was pretty confident, saw my lips moving, and understood that I had spoken words. And I was not at all convinced that they got how important that was for me. So I share that story because there's a quality to listening, and it does involve both emotions and facts. And it's a gift that we can give somebody, even if they frustrate the bejeebers out of us, even if they take up more time than we believe they should, even if we feel like they're disrespecting us. Because not only are emotions contagious, but we have mirror neurons in our brain. And if we continue to behave respectfully and gracefully and graciously, not everybody, but most people will begin to mirror that behavior and will reciprocate. And I think we respect by letting folks know that we hear them. We hear the emotional and we hear the factual. It's terribly powerful. Are there comments, questions about that?
Laura, can you hear me, Laura?
Yes.
Okay, got a question for you. I guess, and maybe this is just a struggle that I have, so maybe it only applies to me and I'm being selfish, but the question is, what if, so you're really excited about this thing you just told me about. I don't have a strong relationship with you and I don't really care that much about this awesome thing you had. What is a good way for me to exercise, you know, caring about that, or, you know, getting excited about what you're excited about, even if, you know, I don't really care, or maybe I need to just start learning to care more about other people.
No, that's a great question, because people will, you know, we have we walk through life assuming that everybody carries the same perspective and the same values. That's simply not true. So that's a great question. I think it is fair to use your words then, right? I mean, the example I provided was both physical and verbal, obviously, and that's frequently wildly inappropriate in the workplace. But you can say, I can see that this is really important to you and that you are filled with joy as a result of this news. I'm delighted that you're so happy, right? I mean, one of the things too, when I'm training people to be mediators is I go on at some length decrying the state of our emotional vocabulary in this country, because in order to share with somebody that we have heard them emotionally, it helps to have some emotional vocabulary. The 5 most commonly used words in our emotional vocabulary in the dominant culture in this country: fine. Really detest that word. It can mean anything from, you know, just barely hanging in there, thanks so much for asking, to having a great day. It's become meaningless. Okay. Angry, happy, and or meh, depending on the generation with whom you're speaking. Those tell us absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So it's useful to expand our emotional vocabulary so that, you know, if we don't feel a personal connection to this news, we can at least say, I can tell you're ecstatic. I can tell you're really discouraged. I can, you know. Does that help? One of my triggers, because I was raised in a family where we did not complain about anything, is people who do a lot of complaining. And so I have to do my 2-second scan and be present for that person. And I've also learned that a complaint is actually a value statement, right? When somebody complains, what we hear and what we focus on is the negativity. But what they're actually saying is, I appreciate and value this, and I don't have that. And I want to replace this, which I do have and do not like, with something else. And that it is that something else that they value. And we can actually have a constructive conversation about that something else, you know, whether or not it's possible, whether it's plausible, but odds are that there's a value in there somewhere with which you at least resonate, even if you don't share it. And so I listen for that now in complaints, and I try to then have a conversation about that positive bit instead. In addition to that quality listening, it's terribly important to not interrupt, if at all possible. If you have the time, even folks who are wildly unhappy, who may be yelling, run out of steam at some point. And it's terribly disarming for them to be heard without interruption and without defensiveness, which is often voiced, right, through an interruption. And so if you don't interrupt them, but you instead take notes about their main points so that you can keep track of them and address them when they finally go. I have seen that over and over and over again. If I can just stick with them and listen to them and demonstrate with body language that I'm with them, they run out of steam and they are in a much better place to be able to hear what you have to say. If you interrupt them, if you become defensive, goes back to that quality of listening, right? They're not at all convinced that you understand their emotional content of what they have to say, and they will keep trying to clarify with you that you understand that emotional import, and they are not in a mental space to be able to hear you at all. Being honest about what you can do and can't do, right? Just terribly important. Most of us want to do whatever we can, and that's not always in our best interest, right? We should not be working 80-hour work weeks, and it can take some courage to be in front of somebody who's irate and say, you know, actually, that's not in my bailiwick, but I can tell you, you know, and I'm not sure who is, but I'll get back to you tomorrow by 5 p.m. and let you know where you should go for that. That's another opportunity for them to learn to trust you. If you say, I don't have the answer, but I will get it to you by, create a timeline, for heaven's sakes, that's reasonable for you, but then get back to them. I took a mindfulness course a long time ago at Harvard, and it was only for attorneys. And attorneys have to, for the most part, nationwide, keep track of every 6 minutes for billable hours. And so, you know, mindfulness is sort of wrapped up in being an attorney in terms of that. You know, I forgot to jot down what I did in those 2 minutes. What do I do with those? And so it was this really interesting week in which we all came in and we were all like this. And by the end of the week, we were speaking more quietly. We were actually falling asleep sometimes during the meditations. My biggest struggle was that I had 2 young children at home and was practicing law. And when I was at work, I was worried about my children. And when I was at home with my children, I was worried about what wasn't getting done at work, right? That doesn't help anybody. So one of the most useful things I learned there was what stresses us out is our perception that things are not as they should be. And so I went home from this workshop just determined to carry this through, you know, and to live the life that I had learned as possible in that week. The very first thing that I was met with were my 2 little young daughters eagerly awaiting mom's return, up way past bedtime. One could argue that might have something to do with their dad as well, but nevertheless, they were in their pajamas, wide awake, bouncing off the walls. And I took a deep breath and thought, well, that's not what should be, but this is what is. And so the point is that we respond to what's in front of us and we think, well, that should never have happened, you know, and then we feel stress and we feel frustrated and we wonder what the other person was thinking. And that rarely leads us to a good mental space for being a problem solver. So instead, if we can, think about, okay, well, this is what is. Now what? What agency do I have in the situation that is? And then finally, watching the recipient of your communication is terribly important. It is so easy for our intended communication to go awry and to be interpreted in a different way than we ever imagined. And so if we are mindful of the body language, the facial expression, or even the response we receive in response to what we say or do, and that response that we are looking at or listening to does not accord with what we thought we were sending as a message, then I strongly encourage you to open up a door and to be curious about it. I thought I was praising you and you look unhappy. And so I'm wondering if you heard what the message I intended to send. And again, that's about being mindful of, you know, the conversation we're in. It's about watching them, and it's terribly powerful because then you've opened a door. Instead of them then spinning in their head thinking, what the heck did she just say to me? You know, you've opened the door and allowed them to, in the moment, respond and clarify, and that gives you an opportunity then to respond and clarify before it does this downward spiral, right? So it's terribly useful. So before I move on to managing stress, are there any questions about difficult conversations, which you must recognize, right? We could spend an entire day on, so 30 minutes, yeah. But given that constraint, does anybody have a question?
Laura, just a quick question. So when possible, I mean, you know, in extension offices, we never have any 4-H problems, but if someone was to come, is there a way to kind of protect where you have that conversation, or is it appropriate to say, can we set up a time rather than somebody just bursting in?
Absolutely. So that's a really great segue to managing stress, right? Again, most of us tend to define professionalism as saying yes more than no. I think we do ourselves and everybody else a terrible disservice by assuming that we have to respond as soon as we hear an email ping in, or, you know, always picking up the phone if we're trying to dive deep into writing a report or something, or immediately stopping what we're doing when somebody rushes through our door, because in fact, we don't frequently do our best work when we've been interrupted in that fashion, right? And tips for us to keep in mind too, sometimes we have a conversation that's really important to us, and so we do the bursting into somebody else's office, forgetting, right, that they may be engaged in their own work with their head someplace else. And to be interrupted is a frustration and an inefficiency in terms of their work product. Their head isn't where yours is. And so, yes, the very long answer, Lyle, is it is appropriate to say, I can see this is really important to you, and I'm in the middle of a project that I need to complete. So when tomorrow will work for you, because I want to do this conversation the justice it deserves. Something like that, right? It's the validation, it's the empowering in terms of choice about when to meet, since you're not going to be meeting now. And it's also self-care. It's stress management, right? It's actually our choice whether or not we always give ourselves over to the person in front of us, the phone that's ringing, the email that just pinged in. Does that answer your question? So does anybody want to talk about what they do to manage stress before I share some tips?
Sure, I'll share.
Awesome. Hello.
Hi, I'm Julie.
Hi, Julie.
I have scheduled a monthly massage. That's really important to me. I'm able to really relax, and it's always a relaxing massage. It's not one of those therapeutic ones, but that's really helpful for me. And then my husband and I get away quite often, so that really, because he works nights and I work days, so we rarely ever see each other. So that just helps me reconnect with the person who's most important to me in my life, and helps me be better both in my personal life and professional life. So those are just, and then I'm really big lately on sleep. I have a sleep routine. I am pretty, I just go to sleep. Sometimes it's 8:30 at night, 9 o'clock at night. The other thing that I'm really committed to in 2019 is not scheduling 12 plus hour days. You know, it's so easy to do, somebody will want to tag something on at the end of the day, and I'm, I just, hey, I can do it this day or this day, but I really can't do it that day. And if they say, oh, that's the only day we're having it, I'll say, here's a list of 3 or 4 other people in our district or state that could, possibly do that for you, because I'm not the only person that needs to do that for them.
Those are fantastic techniques. Thank you for sharing. So,
Laura, I'd exercise. There's here at CSI's campus, College of Southern Idaho, there's spin class Tuesdays, Thursdays, and actually a group of us have started going over from the office here. And so I joke, I sweat out the stress. So.
Awesome. Yeah. So my favorite physical activity is hiking. But I don't always have time for that after a work day. But I always walk at least, right? Moving our bodies is really, really useful. Getting away from the office if you can, even if it's only for 15 minutes for a lunch break. It actually not only helps us to breathe fresh air and to move our bodies, but it also resets our brain when we move into a different space. And so if you've been stuck on a problem, get up and go for a 3-minute walk. Stress results from our subjective perspective of objective factors, right? And one of the main triggers is that this is not how it should be, as we were just discussing. And so keeping in mind, well, this is how it is. So now what? So practice telling yourself, this is how it is. Now what do I do about it? If you don't have control over the situation, you can control the thoughts you are thinking, right? If we're resistant to our circumstances, or we feel unfairly or unjustly treated, or we've decided we just don't like our job, then we look for actions, reactions, situations that confirm those sour feelings. And we might actually miss parts of the day that went well, because we're looking to confirm our predisposition. So being mindful about what you're thinking and how that's impacting how you're feeling. Asking yourself every day, why do I do this? Why am I doing this? And if the answer is meaningful to you, then fantastic, and try to keep that in mind, you know, as you move from one meeting to another. Okay, this isn't the most exciting meeting, but it's headed me towards this objective, and that objective matters to me. If the answer is not meaningful for you, then that's a good time to consider your options. Be conscious of your focus and mindful of where you are. There's all this great research called happy research that's that tells us that the more aimless our thoughts are, the less focused we are, the more negative those thoughts tend to be. Have you ever noticed if like you're driving a long distance, then you're just kind of letting your mind wander, although ostensibly you're focusing on driving. Those thoughts are rarely positive, right? They tend to be about what's going wrong, what didn't go well in that last conversation, what you don't like about this person, what that person said to you that's sort of still sticking in your craw. I have no idea where that saying came from. That's so interesting. But when you are focused on what you are doing, you tend to feel purposeful, you tend to feel happier. There was some research that the subjects agreed to be pinged at least once an hour for months. And I thought, good heavens, don't sign me up for that. That would really annoy me. But regardless, again, of the social identifiers we use to classify ourselves, if they were in the midst of something that required their full attention, their focus, they were diving deep into something, they felt good. They felt good. So be aware. Permit yourself to focus on work when you're at work, and at home when you're at home. Individualizing the people with whom you work, right? Even if this may be your 4,000th meeting about, the people in that meeting may not have experienced the same conversation quite so frequently, and they really need and deserve your full attention and your energy. It's when we start to feel like we're doing the same thing every day with the same people that we start to feel like, am I making a difference, right? So it's important then to find a new face in the crowd, or to listen to a new idea that gets generated in a meeting, because they do happen, and that's where hope lies, and hope is a fantastic motivator. Playing is really, really, really important. I'm in my first year of empty nesting, and I can tell you I am not as good at playing without my kids around. But it matters. When our brain is at rest is when we make those cerebral connections between, you know, the meeting we had at 8 a.m. and the meeting we had at 10 a.m., which felt disparate and unfocused. It might be when we're in a spin class, or when we're off for a walk, or when we just go down the street to get some ice cream and walk really slowly back before we have to move on to the next thing, that we have that aha moment, because it's at rest, it's during sleep, when our brain makes those connections and reflects and translates learning into actionable learning. So sleep. Play, play, sleep. It doesn't matter what it is. If it counts as play for you, then it counts. If, as I certainly was for a long period of time, single parenting, juggling multiple positions, and, you know, coming home to young children, it can be tough to find time to play. But you can be mindful about things that you take pleasure in, right? And sometimes this was all I had in the day, so bear with me. I'm cooking a healthy dinner for my family, right? But thinking about that as I was doing it, instead of stressing about work or stressing about something else, being mindful and purposeful about what we're doing that we feel good about. Or, you know, if you got nothing else, I'm driving home from work where I enjoy what I do and I earn enough money to care for my family. Being mindful about how we spend our time and what we're thinking about. Choosing positive thoughts in the midst of stress. It's a lot like being mindful, but for me, sometimes, you know, when I'm in between visitors who've been sobbing in my office and I'm trying really hard to maintain my positive energy so that the next person who comes in doesn't feel how exhausted I am, I think about my partner who lives in Michigan. Or I think about my daughters who are across the country in 2 different colleges. Or I think about Rocky Mountain National Park, because all of those make me feel happy. And they can be a reset button, right? And it's important to have those. So if you don't have pictures on the wall that make you feel happy, you've got to generate them inside your head and go there whenever you can. And if all you've got is the walk to the bathroom, then you use the walk to the bathroom to think about the next hike you're going to take, or the next time you're going to see your best friend, or whatever. And that is a good segue too, if you can, if you have the time, even if you are always the one who schedules it, she says, feeling that way amongst her own friends. It's important to try to schedule a time at least once a week when you know you're going to sit down with your whole family for a meal, or you're going to go out with friends and play trivia, or, right? Just one thing per week that breaks up the days, that can start to blend together, that can start to feel like, So scheduling that matters. Actually getting it on your calendar, it matters. Creating a physical space for yourself. Not all of us have our own offices, right? Some of us share office space. Some of us have really crowded office space. It's tough to feel like we can regenerate our energy when we're sharing space with others. So again, I know of people, and I've actually coached CEOs who find their space in a bathroom stall, because it's all about what you're doing inside your head, really. It doesn't have to be a beautiful spot. I know of an RN in an emergency room who takes 2 minutes whenever she's got them. She puts out a napkin on her table and she pretends she's having a picnic. And even if she only eats a grape before she's needed again, you know, she's created an ambiance that works for herself just with a napkin and putting her food out. So think about what you can do in the space that you have to create a space that feels restorative for you, that feels like you are celebrating part of who you are, because otherwise we can get lost in the day. And then we go home and there are demands on our time and we get lost in the evening. And we go to bed and we wonder, is it always going to be like this? Right? And that's a tough place to be in. So that leads me to the thoughts you think when you put your head down on the pillow at night. There's also really good research that suggests that the thoughts we're thinking as we go to sleep impact how we feel and the thoughts we think when we wake up the next morning. I find that fascinating. So being purposeful about practicing gratitude, right? Whatever it is in your life, in your day, in your work, in your family, for which you feel grateful, that would be a good time of the day to think about that. Because you're more likely to wake up with positive energy the next day if that's how you went to sleep. I've been talking really quickly and I've gone through a lot. I want to share one more idea and then I want to provide about 10 minutes for questions if you've got them. Neuroscientists tell us that it is impossible for our brains to hold simultaneously both the sense of threat and the sense of compassion. So if there is somebody in your workplace, somebody in your community, somebody with whom you interact regularly, who feels unsafe or who feels wildly negative or who in fact may feel threatening, it's impossible then to feel compassion. And so again, going to that 2-second scan, and again, our brains can hijack us and be our own worst enemy because our brainstem is hardwired from the days of hunting and gathering, right? When if the grass swished a certain way, it made a whole lot of sense to come back to our group and communicate that fact. That did you know that when the grass swishes in a certain way, that means there's a lion nearby? Useful information to transmit. If we had a good day, you know, the sky was blue, the grass never swished in that particular way, all went well, there's not the same sort of imperative to come back to our group and say, good day. And so our brainstem looks for threats. It is hardwired to look for threats. Unfortunately, our brainstem interprets every new situation as a threat. And if it has learned, if your brain has learned, because it is a pattern-seeking organ, that this person or this environment is unsafe based on a prior negative experience, again, your brainstem will hijack your frontal lobe and there you are. So, you know, if I had to sum up the last 50 minutes, I guess it would be mindful because we can get hijacked in so many ways based on past experiences, based on the default setting of our brainstem, based on our energy level, based on the fact that we have limited glucose. So if we're not checking in with ourselves on a regular basis and taking care of ourselves and finding moments of pleasure and ways to de-stress, it can feel like life has taken control of us as opposed to our moving through the world and impacting it in the way we choose to. And there's a tremendously different experience at the end of the day between those two perspectives. Comments, questions?
I need you to just repeat the one thing you said. You can't have a sense of threat and a sense of passion at the same time.
Compassion.
Compassion.
Yeah, and so it is in fact when people are at their worst that ironically they most need compassion from us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily agreement, not necessarily, yes, I will give you what you want, but certainly just from a humanity standpoint, compassion. We are all humans. We all want to be respected. We all want to feel trust in our work environment, right? From that perspective, it's actually impossible to practice compassion if we get hijacked by threat or fear.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's now almost 4. You're probably thinking, well, I'm out of glucose. Do I really have to come up with a question? And if that is in fact what you're thinking, then I'd say that's a really good question. You probably don't.
Laura, this is Barbara Petty, and we have met and visited
Yeah.
before on a number of occasions, and I really appreciate you taking your time to speak to our group. And I really like the ideas that you have presented as far as the way of handling stress and the way of having these difficult conversations. And I think you've just really added to many of our conversations and the importance of taking care of yourself. And we have often said many times that you should be your number one priority and take care of yourself. Because when you're overstressed and you're overcommitted, then you're not at your best. And we just really encourage people to take time off. This morning, I encourage them also to take time off over the holiday. And so thank you. I just really appreciate your thoughts today and what you have shared. And you did mention that mindfulness would be probably the thing that you find that you would leave with us today. Is that correct?
Yeah, mindfulness about who's in front of you, mindfulness about how you're doing, absolutely. Thank you, Barbara.
And I just appreciated it. And one thing that I found myself asking myself so many things in dealing with stress, who really owns this problem? Did I create this problem? And what is my role in this problem? And is it my responsibility to fix it? And so I just leave that with the group that to ask yourself that question. That's another question to ask, you know, whose responsibility is this? Who owns it?
Absolutely. Well, and one of the beauties of that listening, you know, to somebody who might be on a diatribe and just kind of, and it's hard to get a word in edgewise. And then they sort of look at you like, so now what are you going to do about this type of situation? It's really useful to sit back, to be comfortable with silence, to give yourself a moment to reflect about how you want to open with your response, and to say, at the end of all of that, what do you think you need to do next? Right? Because particularly if you're thinking, this is not mine, this is actually not mine, then it's appropriate to lob it back to them and to communicate to them in a very soft and gentle and compassionate way. This is your problem. I'm here as a sounding board. I'm here to refer you if that is what you need, and this is not going to be on me. So that's a great point.
Laura, I know you said you talked about a book, and I got the author's name, but I know you just some takeaways. Is there any TED Talks or anything that you recommend that would be?
Oh my. There's so much. How about, Lyle, if I send to you some of my favorite books and we start there? Is that fair?
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the book I referenced was Moral Courage. I think that's the one that.
Yes, yes. Yeah. That would be helpful.
Also, anything, I feel fairly confident saying that, written by Deborah Tannen. I'm currently reading this. Can you see it? Talking from 9 to 5, Women and Men at Work by Deborah Tannen. She's just a fantastic researcher and author, and everything she writes is about how we communicate and the experiences, again, that hijack us and the reasons we communicate differently. And you know, communication is the meat of how we do our work. So I'm a big fan of hers. She writes about very complex subjects very clearly and very cleanly, and it's easy to access her ideas and thoughts. So,
and I had one
others as well.
And I had one more question for you, and I know you'll be at some of our faculty meetings, but this group that chose to be here today, how could they utilize you, and what could they utilize you for as they have challenges that come up?
Yeah, that's a good question. Normally I do sort of an introduction, and this is how you can use my office. So thank you for asking that. A whole host of ways. I'm happy to be a confidential venting place because sometimes just by getting it out of our head, you know, and where it spins and spins and spins, sometimes I have visitors who come up with their own solutions simply by externalizing it and hearing their voice, and they have an aha moment. I do a lot of coaching. I do a lot of workshops. I do a lot of, I wonder if, you know, or people will come in who've had difficult interactions with others, walk me through it, and then we can talk about different strategies, how they might go back and try again. Or if, you know, they're unlikely to repeat a conversation with the same person, but they feel like they perhaps need some more assertiveness training, I'm happy to do that one-on-one or in a group. You know, anything that has to do with how we interact with others, I'm happy to help.
I think we sometimes forget how useful your office and yourself could be. So I appreciate that, because I think there's times when we just need.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to communicate. I'm happy to Skype or to utilize online resources. I'm happy to talk by phone, and I'm also happy to listen to a request and follow up in person. We are scattered all throughout the state, and there are times when a face-to-face is merited. So I don't want folks who are geographically distant to feel like I won't show up, because I will. So I have and I will. So I want to be clear about that too. I don't want the distance to be a barrier if folks feel like they need to sit down with me, or if there's a whole group that would benefit from a facilitated conversation, or a unit that could use some culture work or.
Thank you.
Mhm. Well, thank you all for being present and dedicating an hour to mindful interactions. I appreciate your efforts.
Thank you, Laura. This was just
Yes,
wonderful.
very good.
We really appreciate you being here today.
My pleasure. You're welcome.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Laura.